Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Josh Good, and it's an honor to welcome you today to our lunch discussion, Edge of Extinction, the Eradication of Religious and Ethnic Minorities in Iraq. Kind of a somber and difficult topic for an exquisite day like this is here in Washington, D.C., but it is, after all, the state of our world, the heartbreaking state of our world, and so here we are. Today we have representatives in the audience, the in-person audience here, from the Embassy of Iraq, from the Jordanian Information Bureau, from the American Islamic Congress, from a number of D.C. area congregations and think tanks and media outlets, Capitol Hill staffers. Thank you so much for coming. Of course, it's not only you. There are, courtesy of these little cameras above you, 9 campuses of student leaders with groups of reading groups and professors who are part of a network of faculty members that are supported here at AEI through our Values and Capitalism project also tuning in. And those campuses include Baylor University, Pepperdine University, Northwestern University, Dordt College, Houghton College, Northwest Nazarene University, Oral Roberts, St. Francis University, Kentucky Christian University, and a number of others. So thank you for joining as well. And so why then are we here today, not under the auspices of our foreign policy shop, which sponsors a number of events about the Middle East and other parts of the world that are troubled today, but by our Values and Capitalism project, which is a special outreach of the American Enterprise Institute to evangelical students and faculty members and administrators throughout the country. Why? Well, 2 reasons, I think. One is global and one is domestic. On the global front, it's just the fact of religious pluralism in our world, what Peter Berger has called the resurgence of religion in world politics. Lots of brilliant scholars, including some of you who are in the room, have written about this, but it's pretty simple, really. Rick Warren was here for an event about a mile up the road several months ago and at Georgetown, and he said that the world isn't getting less religious, it's getting more religious. Look around and you'll see today that there are 600 million Buddhists in the world. There are 800 million Hindus in the world. There are 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, 2.3 billion Christians in the world, 14 million Jews. And that's before we get to Yazidis and folks from the Baha'i community and a number of others that we'll probably talk about during today's discussion. The world is a very religious place. Second, it's the fact of pluralism here at home. And so in spite of the nuns, the rise of the nuns, you know who I mean, right? Not women in the Catholic faith who are wearing headgear, headscarves, but those who are millennials and others who affiliate when Gallup asks them the question about what religion they are as none. And that number is up a bit, particularly this last Gallup poll. But even in spite of those new nuns, America is a pretty religious place. More than a quarter of American citizens today are evangelical or Pentecostal. Another quarter of the United States is Catholic. Another quarter is mainline Protestant. 10% is from an African-American Christian community. 2 to 4% of the country is Jewish. And then there are a few others at the end. Sure, there are secular winds in play, but the country is still a very religious place. And so even in the foreign policy arena, the religious faith convictions of mainstream United States citizens lead to a special connection with some of the human rights abuses and outright persecution that we'll be discussing today. The absence of the rule of law, subject to an event that we hosted for the project with Gary Haugen last year, is something that faithful Christians and faithful Jews and other faith communities are often inclined to care about out of a love for brothers and sisters in faraway places. 2 scholars have suggested that in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, the rise of evangelicalism in particular often leads to increasing democratization of those lands, increased presence of civil society, and the kinds of changes that many of us yearn to see happen in more of the world. So the second question that I hope our panelists will talk a little bit about today it sort of involves the practical question. What can students do? There is somewhere out there right now listening to us, a student leader on a college campus who is thinking about his or her future and is thinking about the future that they might contribute to, and who cares perhaps greatly about the part of the world that we're talking about today in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere. And so in terms of modern media, obviously we have all seen in the room pictures of a Jordanian pilot burning. We have all seen images of 21 Christians on the beaches of Egypt executed by men in headgear, turned into martyrs via ISIS. We often hear in our churches, which will reflect on these matters, in our synagogues, elsewhere, a call to prayer, to care more about that region of the world that is hurting so badly. But what can we do? What can we do? Many of us, particularly students and professors that my colleagues Meredith and Tyler and others here at AEI work with, many of us, at least on campuses, we don't know what to do. And so we can pray, but what more? What role does U.S. foreign policy play? What role should it play vis-a-vis national interests, humanitarian concerns? Not theoretically, but how should Obama and his administration actually engage with the region? What's the role of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, which Daniel now serves on, the youngest member of the commission, which Nina has served on for 13 years? What can it play as a contributing voice? And perhaps more interestingly, for those of us from nonprofits and from universities, what role should the grassroots play? Now, the new 21st Century Wilberforce Initiative, which is led by Mr. Wolf and his colleagues, Lou and Elise, who helped us put together this event today. What role do grassroots groups play in a democracy like ours? So to answer that question, we'll begin by turning directly to Congressman Wolf, who will provide some opening comments. Obviously, he has just been in the region, and you have his bio there in front of you. Following him, we'll turn to two more foreign policy experts who will offer a response, a piece, before we turn to you for conversation, for questions. You have their bios in front of you, so I won't rehash what you have printed there. But suffice to say, we are joined in Congressman Wolf by a 34-year congressman, a true human rights giant. So it's a pleasure, it's a privilege to have him here at AEI today. We're joined by Nina Shea, and a longstanding warrior for religious freedom purposes, and who's been in the arena for some time to come, and now in her leadership of the Religious Freedom Center at Hudson. And we're joined in Daniel Mark by the youngest ever member of the commission, who's now teaching at Vanderbilt. He's a protege of Robbie George. A number of you know him. He serves on AEI's Council of Academic Advisors. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for being here to our panel. And Mr. Wolf, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Joss, and thank AEI for holding this event, and I want to thank all of you for being here. A delegation from the 21st Century Wilberforce Initiative, which was founded by Randall Everett, who I believe is in the back of the room here, which I joined upon retiring from Congress, visited northern Iraq in late January. We did not use the American Embassy, and we were not bound by the State Department's restrictions prohibiting congressional delegations from spending the night in Iraq, despite the relatively safety of the Kurdistan area. As a result, we had several days to get a real feel for the situation on the ground. We interviewed over 75 individuals, including dozens of Christians and Yazidis. As the report indicates, the situation is very, very grim. In Iraq in 2003, there were roughly 1.5 million Christians. Today, there are over roughly 200,000 to 350,000, some say upward to 300,000, but roughly 12 families leave Iraq every day. This is a staggering decrease by any measure, but especially given the ancient roots of the Christian community and the faith community there. More biblical activity took place in Iraq than any other country other than Israel. Great patriarch Abraham came from Ur. My first visit when the war broke out, we were in Nasiriyah. Nasiriyah is modern day Ur. Isaac's bride Rebekah came from northwest Iraq. Abraham's grandson Jacob spent 20 years in Iraq, and his sons, the 12 tribes of Israel, were all born in northwest Iraq. The remarkable spiritual revival portrayed in the book of Jonah occurred in the city of Nineveh, present-day Mosul, which is now controlled by ISIS. And you also have a picture of blowing up Jonah's tomb roughly about 5 months ago. The burial tombs for Jonah, Nahum, whose tomb we saw when we were there at a little cemetery pretty close to the ISIS border. Daniel and Ezekiel are all buried in Iraq, and the Apostle Thomas was believed to be the first one to bring the Christian faith to Iraq. While there may always be a remnant, Iraq's Christian community is facing extinction if the current trajectory stays the same. A group of leading Christian religious leaders representing thousands of adherents lamented the following, quote, they said, "This is not just the end of Christianity, but is the end of our ethnicity for those of us who have lived in this region for thousands of years." They went on to say, "We believe it's genocide," and speaking personally for myself and no one else, I believe what's taking place to the Yazidis clearly meets the Raphael Lemkin definition of genocide, but also, I think, what's taking place to the Christians. A phrase not often heard outside the Middle East is first the Saudi people and then the Sunni people. In 1948, in Iraq, the number of Christians was 150,000. Today, there are less than 10 elderly Jewish individuals. Some say it's actually down to 4. It appears that there is more truth to this phrase than we would like to admit. Of course, other religious minorities living in the path of ISIS have suffered incredible persecution and hardship. The Yazidi community foremost among them. Probably the Yazidis have suffered perhaps more than anybody else. As ISIS advanced last summer, and the cities of Mosul and Tikrit fell to the barbarism, Yazidi men were killed and captured. Yazidi women and children were sold, raped, and tortured. One Yazidi leader whom we spoke with told us that his pregnant sister-in-law was captured and sold by ISIS. And he said, quote, "They were selling the virgin girls for $20. He says, unbelievable. In 1944, as I said, Raphael Lemkin coined the word genocide to describe the Nazi policies aimed at the destruction of the European Jews. According to the United Nations definition, ISIS has committed genocide against the Yazidis, and many people think also against the Christians. Ronald Reagan said that the words in the Constitution and the words in the Declaration of Independence were a covenant. A covenant is more significant than a contract, but a covenant we have made not just with those gathered at Independence Hall in 1776 or 1787 when we ratified the Constitution, but with the world, with the student protesters in Tiananmen, and with the displaced Iraqi nun in 2015. We have a moral obligation to those today who suffer in internally displaced person camps, involuntary nomads in their own land, and America and the West, as of this moment, is failing to meet its obligations. They're destroying the covenant that Reagan said the covenant doesn't mean very much now based on what's being done today. This is not merely a human rights or religious freedom atrocity. The situation in Iraq represents a very grave national security threat. ISIS poses a direct threat to the West, to the United States. While estimates vary, it is believed that they count among their numbers 25,000 recruits from outside the region, 5,000 or more from Great Britain and Europe, and anywhere from 140 to 180 here from the United States. Boko Haram, the Nigerian-based Islamist terror group, has pledged allegiance to ISIS, and al-Shabaab, who was responsible for the death in Kenya. There are a number of Americans, the last time 14 or more, who have left the United States and gone to fight for al-Shabaab, and some have been killed actually fighting for al-Shabaab. And of course, there was a horrific beheadings of 21 Coptic Christians on a Libyan beach by an ISIS affiliate, and the more recent slaughter of 30 Ethiopian and Eritrean Christians. These wanton acts of terror, I believe, and most others do, threaten international stability. I reluctantly maintain we are not currently winning in the battle against ISIS. But that is mostly because we're only doing a fraction we're only doing a fraction of what could be done. The Obama administration and the Congress has struggled to develop a coherent policy detailing how to defeat and ultimately destroy ISIS. On numerous occasions, the Obama administration has gone to great lengths to avoid saying that Christians were targeted for their faith. When the New York Times said 21 Coptic Christians beheaded in Libya, the Guardian newspaper said the same, and the Obama administration said 21 Egyptians. And he had the same language used for the 148 Christians killed in Kenya. In the short term, there are some immediate steps the administration could take. There's already a consensus in Congress for supporting local forces committed to protecting the vulnerable minorities in Nineveh Plains and elsewhere. The notion is stated in the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2015, which is now the law. I believe it was the 11th Amendment. And Iraqi Christians have begun training new recruits for the Nineveh Protection Unit, a National Guard capable of defending the future Nineveh Plains province once these lands are liberated. We, the delegation, we visited the NPU. The men are eager. They're not going to be the point of spear against ISIS, but they are eager to defend their own communities. They're eager to defend their mothers, their fathers, their sisters, their wives. Enter the Kurds and their fighting force, the Peshmerga. They are not Boy Scouts, but the Kurds are unique. They are unique in their pro-American sentiments, and they are prepared to battle. They are prepared to battle the Islamic State, and at least historically in that area of the Kurdish area. Roughly 1,000, some say up to 1,700 have been killed, and yesterday I was told almost 4,000 have been seriously wounded. In meeting after meeting, leaders of the Kurdistan regional government lamented to us the lack of direct support from our country, from Washington, D.C. Touring a Peshmerga outpost 1.5 miles from the front, we heard that they are desperate for modern weapons and training to adequately confront ISIS, which is equipped to the hilt with state-of-the-art U.S. weaponry captured in the Iraqi army's retreat. If such weapons came with conditions, including Kurdish support for Nineveh province for religious minorities, Christians, Yazidis, and Turkmen, it would advance both U.S. national security imperatives and also, I think, the Iraqi government's imperatives, but also, equally important, our values. Congress has an important role to play here, both holding the administration's feet to the fire on these issues in particular, while also holding hearings on the manifold threat posed by ISIS. Have extensive hearings. Let the American people know. Don't hide how many have gone. Let them know what's coming over in the internet. Hearings on the threat, on ethnic and religious cleansing, on genocide in Iraq, U.S. counterterrorism policy, and much more. Our final policy recommendation for the president boils down to hiring someone for a job. Last summer, Congress overwhelmingly passed bipartisan legislation creating a special envoy for religious minorities in the Middle East post at the State Department. Christians, Yazidis, Baha'is, Ahmadis, Copts. And the president signed it into law in August precisely at the time that ISIS was on the move in Iraq, when the media was really not focusing, having death and destruction in its wake. The post has been vacant since last August. It passed the Congress, and other positions have been filled with regard to issues that were never passed by Congress, and more than 50 prominent faith-based organizations, academic pastors, and opinion shapers in the world of religious freedom, including prominent diaspora communities and organizations, signed a letter. A broad group, I think 55 groups came together to sign a letter urging the president to fill this spot. The letter argued that part of the significance in filling the post, it would signal to the beleaguered communities in the Middle East and beyond that America stands by them. Because the group will tell you that we're there. They all said, does anybody in the West care about what's taking place? You would talk to a young woman with a baby, say, do they care about us here? It should be filled immediately by someone. And I would throw the names out. Katrina Lanto Sweat. Her dad was a leader, chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Her husband was a Democratic congressman, a good man from New Hampshire. Former Congressman Mike McIntyre, committed, good guy. He could just start this job on day one. And Chris Seipel, all of them could do the job immediately on day one. They would not have to have training at the Foreign Service Institute in Arlington and learning everything. They would be able to start on day one. President Reagan fearlessly championed human rights and religious freedom in dealing with the Soviet Union, making it a central component and bipartisan, I might say, of a U.S. foreign policy. Reagan's international efforts were buoyed. They were buoyed by an engaged and committed domestic constituency, best embodied by the American Jewish community, especially its young people, who labored tirelessly and effectively to make the issue of Soviet refusings politically potent for both Republicans and Democrats, and we should be doing that on this issue now. A similar passion, focus, and creativity and urgency must animate from people of faith. In America today, the political establishment, especially the administration, is forced to confront the bleak situation facing religious freedom, notably religious minorities around the world. The church. You say Christian colleges are watching. The church must act. Genocide and the emergence of a caliphate in the cradle of Christianity is not being met with urgency nor with action. What remains to be seen is whether policymakers, faith leaders, students, and people of goodwill can be propelled to act. As of now, very little is being done. We are letting the women that we talk to who have their babies in their arms, who are crying and begging us to do, we are letting them down. German Luther pastor and anti-Nazi dissident Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, silence in the face of evil is evil itself. We are being silent. If Bonhoeffer is right, and I believe he is, he said, silence in the face of evil is evil itself. He said, not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. So by us not speaking, by the administration not speaking, by the Congress not speaking, by the church leaders not speaking, by student groups not speaking, and not acting, we are basically acting. We're saying we're not going to get involved, we're not going to do anything. We really must. And I think our conscience will all be held. We will all be held accountable. This is taking place whether it goes poorly or goes well. It's taking place on our watch. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor to follow Frank Wolf, and it's an honor for me to be on this panel with Daniel, Mark, and be here at the AEI. Frank Wolf is known as the godfather of international religious freedom. It was because of him that we have the International Religious Freedom Act of '98. And we have the State Department annually reporting on religious freedom and the creation of the International Religious Freedom Commission, where Daniel is currently a commissioner and where I had the privilege of serving. And this means that the concern for religious freedom is institutionalized within our government, within our foreign policy, and many other countries now are looking towards the United States to model this, and this was Frank's initiative, so it's a real honor for me to be here. I really give so much credit to Frank that even though he stepped down from Congress, he has continued with the 21st Wilberforce Initiative to continue paying attention to international persecution. And going to Iraq is first off the bat, and reminding us that tomorrow is the reminding us of this deep problem of religious cleansing that's going on in the Middle East today against the Christians today and the Yazidis and the Jews yesterday and the Mandeans who have also disappeared from Iraq. And reminding us of today, the day before the Armenian Christian community commemorates the 100th anniversary of their genocide at the National Cathedral up on Wisconsin Avenue. Tomorrow is the day that they are going to be commemorating that Holocaust. The radical Islamist today see religious freedom as a vice. They believe that apostates and blasphemers should be killed. And to me, this is the root of the problem. There's a lot of talk about what is the root of ISIS, and to me, that is the root of ISIS. Their utter rejection of religious freedom and the freedom of expression that goes with it, hand in hand. This is a very different paradigm from what we're used to. In the past, countries, governments pay lip service to religious freedom as a fundamental human right. And often the solution was to turn the spotlight on these problems, to build pressure by publicizing what was happening. It would spare lives. It would result in prisoner releases. And Frank has gone to many prison cells throughout the world and doing just that in his career. But now we're seeing ISIS brandish on videos its zero tolerance, its cruel and brutal way of dealing with those who are not sharing their religious views, and doing it in the name of Islam in an attempt to what they consider purify the land for Islam. And this is resulting in a region of the world that was known as the Middle East, the crossroads of civilizations for millennia, a cultural mosaic. It's resulting in the eradication, as Frank's report puts it, the extinction of a number of groups, everyone who does not actually, all non-Muslims, and those who don't share, in particular, the beliefs of these radical terrorist groups. The Christians and those other non-Muslims have been treated, had a dhimmi status under the Ottoman Empire for many centuries. That was second-class citizens. Then under Arab nationalism, they got citizenship, although often under cruel tyranny and dictatorship. And now we're faced with this convert or die policy. There's no jizya tax option. There's no second-class citizenship offered. It's basically convert or die. And that's what the Christians and Yazidis faced last summer, beginning almost a year ago on the Nineveh Plain. And this occurs despite the rejection of this by some very prominent Muslim voices like Ayatollah Sistani or the Jordanian royal family, or President Sisi now in Egypt. And it's not just the Christians and Yazidis. It's also, as I said, the Mandeans, the Jews in Iraq, the Baha'is in Iran, who have, under their constitution, absolutely no rights whatsoever, not even the right to live. The Ahmadiyya, who are have no rights to worship as Muslims in Pakistan and many other places. It's the eradication of the entire presence of these groups. It's not just acts of persecution, it's the total eradication or extinction, as Frank puts it. This is a crime against humanity. And overlaid on this it is occurring in a context of a Sunni Shiite struggle for dominance and survival. Struggle to the death. So the balance of power has been disrupted in the Middle East, and this is likely to get worse before it gets better. There may be a successful effort to force ISIS out of various places in Iraq, but overall it's going to get to be very, very bloody. And while the radical Islamists think that religious freedom is a vice, there is a vocal and very powerful sector within our own community in the West that sees it the same way. And these are people who, I was just speaking at the museum a couple weeks ago in an event that the British government helped sponsor, and was asked by some angry people in the audience who were very concerned about the Indiana RFRA legislation. Why should we give religious freedom space when it violates other people's rights? So at the very same time that the Islamists think that religious freedom is a vice, some of our people do too in the West. And while religious freedom was for many decades, we would call it the, and I've been involved in this for many decades, the redheaded stepchild of the human rights structure. And but now it's even gotten worse. And what they meant by that was that there were women's rights, gender rights, migrants' rights, race rights, all of these rights emerging, these group rights. This individual right of religious freedom and freedom of expression were basically sort of out of fashion, were forgotten or inconvenient. But now it's become actually politically incorrect to talk about religious freedom, or to talk about the ideology undergirding the persecution, this terrible religious cleansing that's going on in Iraq, in Nigeria, in Kenya, and numerous Syria, many other places. There's a reluctance to talk about Christians or Jews or others groups being Baha'is, being the victims of such attacks. We are political leaders, and this goes back a long way. George W. Bush called it, his administration called it the war on terror. President Obama calls it violent extremism. The UK is having elections tomorrow, and this hasn't come up at all in the debates, I'm told. So part of this is self-restraint because people are uncomfortable talking about it or find it politically incorrect. But sometimes it's also not voluntary or free. It's driven by fear. And I saw this firsthand in the UN when the special rapporteur on Sudan, Gaspar Biro, a young Hungarian lawyer, talked about, he gave his report on Sudan at the time, and denounced the stoning, the law that called for the stoning of children and for adultery. And he was issued actually a death threat, which they called a fatwa by the Minister of Justice who was sitting in this council chamber in Geneva. So fear drives, fear is the blasphemy that is taboo in criticizing anything that mantles itself in Islam is not related or limited solely to irreverent cartoons or burning of Quran. It's also sometimes human rights criticism. So the administration now not only refuses to talk about the ideology undergirding it or who the victims are in Iraq today, in Syria, Nigeria, and Kenya, calling them, as Frank said, Egyptian citizens or innocent people or Kenyan people or Iraqi citizens, everything but the fact that their religious identity has put them in the line of fire. And he's also, as I've been writing about this week, the administration is denying a visa to someone who's very articulate Christian from Iraq, a nun, a Catholic nun, not the millennials, but the religious woman who speaks perfect English and is very knowledgeable, both as a victim herself of ISIS and also as a humanitarian aid giver. She has a broad perspective on her people. And while others from other religious groups were given visas, the sole Christian in this delegation was not. Now, the what to do about this? Well, the first point is to acknowledge who are the victims and why they are victims. Because there's incidents, because the policies flow from that correct analysis. I awoke one morning a couple months ago to desperate emails from clerks in the region saying that the villages in Kabul Valley in Syria were surrounded by ISIS, and where were the U.S. airstrikes, that there was civilians there, thousands of them, and that they were going to die. Well, it turns out that the Kabul River Valley is a 40-kilometer strip close to the Iraq and Turkish borders. It is comprised of 33 Christian villages, and it's right near Kobani, the place that we liberated. We helped liberate with the help of the Peshmerga. After we drove out ISIS from Kobani, 40 pickup trucks, a convoy of 40 pickup trucks of ISIS, then went to this Christian area. It was completely predictable. It's strategic. It's completely defenseless because the Christians have not taken sides and not taken up arms in these battles in Syria and Iraq. And so ISIS drove out another 5,000 Christians just in March, and it took over strategic land and then took 300 hostages who haven't been seen since. The U.S. could be doing many different things. Sometimes it would be simple things like we see in Nigeria today when there's a political will. The government suddenly released, went in and rescued 1,000 women and children who have been captive sometimes for the past year, basically acting as slaves, being forced as slaves to Boko Haram. Why weren't we working with the Nigerian government to do this much earlier? Why weren't we sharing communications or intelligence or training? I'm against boots on the ground. We can't be the world's policemen, but we can transfer some of our knowledge and intelligence and training and local counterterrorism to these other countries. There's an objection that these militaries also are human rights violators, and that is a problem. There's objection in Iraq. There was an objection that it was sectarian. That was a problem. It is a problem. But we have to find, the United States has to find a way of working with some elite troops or building up some counter-terrorist troops to solve these horrific human rights violations. So I guess I'm out of time now. So, okay. And then there's the difficult, let me just say with this last thing, there are difficult problems too. Mosul's a difficult problem. Mosul is a city, a Sunni city, a largely Sunni city of 1.5 million people. 500,000 left. They were mostly Sunni and almost entirely Sunni Muslim who left. And they were the ones who did not share ISIS's belief system and were frightened and didn't want any part of it. Those who remain, some of them, 1 million have remained, and some of them are Saddam Hussein's former generals. Some of them may be Salafis who share ISIS's worldview, and others may have adapted and have benefited from it. There of course are a segment of them that we don't know how large is, but who object to ISIS and can't leave for some reason. That's going to be very tough. That urban warfare offensive for liberating Mosul is going to be very, very tough, and it's a tough fight, and it's going to be very bloody. And there is the problem of who holds it. And until Mosul is freed of ISIS, the Nineveh plain where the Christians lived and the Yazidis lived before ISIS rolled in will not be safe, will not be secure. So this is a tough problem, and we're going to have to figure out ways to tackle it. But we have to understand what is driving this ideology and who are its victims. So I will conclude there.
Thank you so much, Nina. And I'm really glad you mentioned Nigeria, because I understand that Daniel is getting on a train and going back home and packing his bag for a week to go just there. Professor Mark.
Thanks, Josh. My parents just looked into their computer screens and said, "You're going where?" Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having me. I'm Daniel Mark. I teach at Villanova University, and as you heard, I am the youngest member on USCIRF, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, youngest by about a generation, but try to hold my own, and hopefully that means I can also speak to the students out there on the internet. I'll refer to some of our work on the Commission in a bit, and I'll be happy to discuss it more in the question period, but I do want to say that the editorializing I offer is all my own. I'm especially happy to be here under the auspices of Values in Capitalism. Those are two things I really like a lot. And especially to its leader, Josh Good, and all the wonderful people at AEI for putting on this event and inviting me. I'm very honored to be on a panel with former USERF Commissioner Nina Shea, and especially with former Congressman and, yes, USERF godfather Frank Wolf. I have godfather written down here too. That was already printed out before. So I guess that's you. And a lot of people start calling you the godfather, might worry, but for now we're okay. I'm also grateful, very grateful to Mr. Wolf and his colleagues at the 21st Century Wilberforce Initiative for the important report that is the touchstone for our discussion today. Just before I sat down this past weekend to put the finishing touches on my remarks, I opened the news to discover that ISIS had just executed 300 captives. I'm sure many of you saw this as well. I must say, we of the 20th and now 21st century are rather good at witnessing genocides, ethnic cleansings, and other forms of extermination. We did a good job watching the Holocaust happen, and 50 years later, we watched the slaughter in Rwanda. 100 years after the Armenian genocide, we are still trying to figure out how to talk about it. In reviewing the background material for this event, I could not avoid the thought that the modern Middle East is simply not a friendly place for religious minorities. As the Wilberforce report grimly reminds us, and as Mr. Wolf just mentioned, first the Saturday people and then the Sunday people. In the middle of the last century, ancient Jewish communities were driven from the Middle East to North Africa. Ancient communities that just decades ago numbered in the hundreds of thousands are completely gone. We did a good job witnessing that catastrophe too. And now, what happened to the Saturday people is happening to the Sunday people. Maybe we were too sanguine about the inevitability of progress, of an inexorable turn toward democracy and peace, especially after the Cold War and the so-called end of history. That was always one possibility. But the other possibility was that the forces of intolerance and hatred would gain the upper hand, and for the moment, it appears they have. I'm here today, unfortunately, to offer a heavy dose of pessimism, and I will leave it to the rest of you to talk me back afterward to a more hopeful outlook. To paint this picture, I'm doing okay with the microphone here. To paint this picture of woe, let me first say how bad things are, then venture a guess about why we're watching it happen, and finally lament the limits of even the best proposals for action. To do this, I'm going to have to throw out a lot of points very quickly, but I'll do so with the hope that they will be my provocative contribution to the ensuing discussion. First, I want to emphasize the breadth and depth of this crisis. I don't need to describe it at length. I commend to all of you the detailed, vivid, and moving report by 21 Wilberforce that you've heard about. But let me say this clearly. The people on the other side, ISIS and their comrades in arms, are barbarians. Barbarians of the worst kind. These are people who don't just go in for the usual rape, torture, and killing of your ordinary barbarians. These are people, as the report tells us, who separate women by eye color to suit the preferences of their ravagers. The acuteness of this evil is rivaled only by the world historical scope of it. For me, observing the tragic events in Iraq called to mind the destruction by the Taliban of the giant Buddha statues that had stood for a millennium and a half. How can we not weep for history? These are treasures that once lost can never be recovered. And today, we talk not of artifacts, but of communities stretching back just as far. The first time Sunday Mass or Christmas Mass or whatever the statistic was not celebrated in Mosul for 1,600 years. As each of these ancient communities is destroyed, we lose a piece of world history forever. And simply on the human level, the loss of homes, of life savings, of educational opportunities like the Yazidi med students mentioned in the report. Someone please tell me a story of how all of this gets restored. What are the chances of these people actually returning and reconstituting their ancient communities? It is hard to imagine it happening. Now we are just in damage control mode, how to minimize the suffering. So why are we watching this happen? Have we not learned our lesson enough times? In one respect, maybe it's not our fault. After all, this did happen very suddenly. Did we know with enough time to do anything? Even in retrospect, what could have been done differently? ISIS, for example, did not have the courtesy to give us fair warning by passing Nuremberg laws several years in advance. And as Nina Shea just said, the world is a tough place, and even the most hawkish observer will admit that we can't address every evil. But I think we also need to be honest with ourselves and admit that there is little appetite in the US or in the world to do anything, regardless of what we knew and when we knew it. Mr. Wolf quoted the woman who asked, "Does anyone care?" Well, does anyone care? Does anyone care enough to do anything? At the very fine university where I teach, we are in final exams. My students are taking 1 and 2 hours without me. So, like at any prestigious school, and I know you out there in the audience know what I'm talking about, there are signs like this one. Let dogs and a bunny decrease your stress from exams. Now, I am down for a puppy party as much as the next person, but my main thought upon seeing that flyer was, this is why our country will never win another war. When the stress of final exams is a reason to go to therapy, how can there be stomach for fighting ISIS? And turning from psychology to politics, I note that the U.S. has been the victim, as all of you know, of a steady barrage of criticism for its foreign interventions, going back at least as far as Vietnam. It seems that when we act in the world, we can do nothing right. Perhaps a venture into Iraq to stop ISIS would have been seen as yet more blood for oil. Moreover, not only have people lost sight of the symbiotic relationship between humanitarianism and national interest, but it even seems that humanitarian efforts cannot be credited unless they are altogether divorced from, if not downright opposed to, our national interests. As for the world, well, the world managed to sustain its attention for about as long as the relevant hashtag kept the crisis trending in social media. And where are the big bad UN and its fearsome blue helmets when you need them? So many condemnations of Israel to issue, so little time. Okay, so enough complaining. What is to be done? For that, too, I refer you to the excellent suggestions at the end of the Wilberforce report. And I don't want to be a wet blanket, but I have to offer the following caveats. And I say this as someone who supports all the recommendations in the report. 1, the creation of a separate province for Christians and other religious minorities would help, but would also contribute to the balkanization of Iraq in particular and the Middle East in general, which we in the US are officially against, and which could bring peace or could bring untold instability. 2, an independent security force, as Mr. Wolf mentioned, is similarly a good idea, but also contributes to that balkanization and impedes the centralization of the Iraqi military against the proliferation of local sectarian militia. 3, the return of property is a good idea as well, but is extremely hard to do. Furthermore, compensation in lieu of actual return would aid the cause of justice, but will not restore these communities. 4th, strengthening a Kurd-led plurality is not an action item, just a nice idea, and unfortunately we know from the report itself that it was the Peshmerga who overnight abandoned 200,000 people on the Nineveh plain and left the city of Karakosh, leaving the people completely exposed. 5, aid, especially in the form of education and healthcare, is absolutely critical, but this too will not restore the communities. 6, well, you can guess what I think about the ICC, but even the best international tribunal will not bring these people back to their homelands, even if they help achieve some measure of justice in other ways. In other words, even in the best case scenario, it is hard to imagine how the damage can be undone. Diaspora Jews found a way to recover after the Holocaust, but they did so elsewhere. Iraqi Christians too can rebuild elsewhere. Similarly, the recommendations of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, such as raising the refugee resettlement ceiling, may alleviate tremendous suffering. Indeed, it may be a moral imperative to lift the refugee resettlement ceiling. But these proposals, too, are the enemy of restoration. We should do all of these things, but we need to be realistic about the future of these communities in their ancestral homelands. And not realistic because we shouldn't try, but realistic in understanding how difficult this task is. And, just in case I have not been sufficiently provocative, let me close with a word about the challenges facing us at USCIRF itself in addressing this crisis. At USCIRF, we advise the President, the State Department, and Congress on foreign policy with respect to international religious freedom. While the Pew study cited in the Wilberforce report estimates that a quarter of the world faces high levels of hostilities against religious freedom, Pew also estimates that 3/4 of the world's population lives under governments that perpetrate or tolerate severe violations of religious freedom. One of USCIRF's tools is to recommend countries for designation by the State Department as countries of particular concern, or CPCs, thereby triggering sanctions or other diplomatic actions. But the current crisis is driven by a non-state actor. We at USERF hope that new legislation in Congress will empower us to treat non-state actors within this mechanism, but short of fighting, even given the widest latitude, it is hard to engage an entity that does not sit within the international system. Moreover, as a bipartisan commission, we certainly have our own disagreements, and those disagreements run the gamut. There are disagreements about how to classify conflicts, whether or not they are properly cases of religious conflict, and therefore whether or not they fall within our purview at all. Disagreements about when to use the hard diplomacy of naming and shaming violators versus when to use soft diplomacy of private letters and backdoor negotiations. And, even though we are an independent commission outside of the executive branch, disagreements about when to recommend action or when to stay silent instead and protect the administration if our recommendations are at odds with the president's objectives or official narrative. So it can be hard to get things done sometimes. And, as I said, even what can be done may not be enough to restore Christians, Yazidis, and others to their homes. But we must do something and not just witness another genocide. And so to the students in the audience back at home, get working. And to everyone else, thank you so much. Thank you to AEI and 21 Wilberforce for bringing us together for this very important conversation.
All right, so I just asked the Godfather, and he's okay going straight to questions, so we're going to do just that. Obviously, this being AEI, there have been a lot of topics raised just now, and anybody who's willing to come spend an hour and a half inside these windows on a day like today obviously has something inner that is motivating you to be here. We're grateful for that. Please ask your question in the form of a question, and we'll go straight to that. Here's the first. By the way, the word for this in values and capitalism is called oikonomia, and it means stewardship, and we are stewarding the time that we all have in the room to put the spotlight on the right thing. Here we go. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Two very quick questions. Number one, what is the status of what I understood was basically being called a Christian army? It was being advised by young American veterans of our armed forces. I'd like to know if anybody knows much more about that. And also that are in fact fighting against ISIS. And number two, isn't the ultimate solution that the United States put a great deal of military, political, and economic pressure on our so-called allies in the Muslim world to defeat ISIS militarily and get rid of them? Isn't that the ultimate solution?
On the group, we visited the Christian group. They are men who are committed. They're not going to be the point of spear against ISIS. They're committed to defending their moms and their dads and their grandmoms and their grandfathers and their sisters and their daughters and their wives. That's what they are. They are being trained. They don't have the resources. Senator Levin, God bless him, put some language in whereby, but the administration has not really helped them. And so they need our government to come to their assent. But that's not to defeat ISIS. It's strictly to protect their villages and their families. Yes, we visited. Well, we visited them. We were there the third day that they were there. They were taking the mattresses out. We spoke to them. They're all committed. It's like if somebody would come into your little village, wherever you might live, and they were going to do something to your mom or your dad or your sister, you want to help. These are men who have come in and they're looking for some help. They don't have the adequate weapons. They don't have. There were some former American soldiers who were training them, very skilled, very good, but they don't have the resources of a government to come in and aid and help. And I think we need our government. Again, they are not to fight ISIS. They are to defend their villages. But our government needs to step up, and as of now, they have not. But they are really concerned to protect their own neighborhood.
You know, regarding the pressure to get rid of ISIS on our allies, it is absolutely necessary, but as I pointed out, overlaid on all these fights that we're seeing in Iraq or Syria is this Sunni Shiite battle to the death going on. And we are putting some pressure on places like Turkey and Saudi Arabia. and it's not really having an effect. In fact, I just read about ammonium nitrate being fertilizer being shipped across the border now from Turkey to Syria to create fertilizer bombs a la Oklahoma City. And this is going on freely, and it's reported about in the New York Times, and everybody knows about it, and they acknowledge that it's not for agriculture, it's for bombs. So why doesn't Turkey do it? Because it wants to get rid of Assad, and it doesn't want Iran on its border. So this is a much larger conflict going on top of these skirmishes or these horrible, bloody human rights issues. It's not so easy. And then as far as the Nineveh and these Christian forces, Nineveh, keep in mind, is a plain. It's about the size of Lebanon. It's a natural battlefield. It has been served as battlefields. I compared those villages to 7-Eleven. It's always open and no real security. They're going to be, so these defense forces, like Frank said, will be helpful, sort of like neighborhood watches once there's peace. And I was relieved to see that the Bishop of Mosul, the Catholic Bishop, Chaldean Warda, yesterday was quoted in the press saying that he was for a National Guard and for the Christians integrated into the National Guard. Before that, the church leaders seemed to have been asking for the blue helmets. So they seem to be off that idea, which is a good thing. But it's not going to solve getting rid of ISIS to begin with.
And just one more quick thing on that last point. It seems that the Obama administration may have a plan to have a country in the Middle East defeat ISIS, and that country is Iran. And that's a problem. I would commend to you the writings of a colleague of Nina Shea at Hudson and Michael Duran, who's been writing about this a lot. And the question is, if we make friends with Iran or empower them to defeat ISIS, either as an excuse to empower them or for the sake of defeating ISIS, we may get a different problem in the Middle East, which we're probably going to get anyway, but keep that in mind.
And of course, we commend you, all of AEI's resources on that same front. Just Google top 3 and Iran and AEI in the same line, and you'll get some great stuff in 2 or 3 minutes or less. Meredith, the next question right there.
Yes, thank you. Congressman Wolf, just in the last, while you were speaking, I received a text message that our organization had received permission to move 20 women, Iraqi women from Amman and their children to a European government. That's a total of 60 people. I know that Jordanian rep is here. They are suffering the largest urban refugee crisis in history. The overwhelming majority of refugees are not in camps. They're in basement buildings. They're freezing together during winter. I personally delivered the kerosene heaters to them. The population of Beirut has doubled in the last 6 years without a single building being constructed. The world is ignoring a greater IDP problem, a greater refugee problem than existed during World War II. And it is virtually unmentioned. And I have great empathy for the Jordanian government. And what can we do? What pressure can we put on to the West in order to deal with this situation?
You're right, and I have great respect for the Jordanian government and for the king. We toured also, I was there last year we went through the camps in Lebanon. Lebanon has been overwhelmed. They literally cannot handle it. That's one of the reasons we wanted this special envoy. Anna Eshu and I wanted a special envoy. The special envoy that brought about the peace in Sudan was former Senator John Danforth. President Bush appointed John Danforth in the Rose Garden. Danforth was in the middle. President Bush was on one side and Colin Powell was on the other. And they said, this is our person. And we need somebody of that credibility, if you will, to be the point of reference. But you're absolutely right. We should be doing things. There are some groups out there. World's Vision is doing a good. Samaritan's Purse is doing a wonderful job. Catholic Conference is doing some. Caritas is doing, but it's not nearly enough. And the conditions in these places are grim. Probably less so today when the weather warms up, but when it gets cold again. So you're exactly right. That's why we thought to have one place that you could go and then they could liaison with AID, do whatever they do. But you're exactly right. It needs to be done. And I think Jordan is going to suffer tremendously, as will Lebanon. In fact, I think the Lebanese government, we were told by people there that next was Jordan.
right there in the back. Let's go to this one right here in the back, Tyler.
Thank you all very much for great presentations. My question is about the narrative that is being perpetrated about what's happening. Nina, it seems like deja vu all over again. I remember a paper you wrote before the International Religious Freedom Act was passed called "The Myopia of Human Rights Groups" when it came to Christian persecution, and that's always stuck with me. I think we're seeing that myopia again. Can you talk a little bit about that, the narrative that we're seeing? You talked a little bit about that, but how do we change that narrative so that people are seen as victims?
And I'll go, but you go ahead since you mentioned you.
Thanks, Faith. Yeah, well, I think that we need to bring out these stories because the media is not, the religious media is, but the secular media, you don't read about this stuff. And that's why I think, really give so much credit to Frank for risking his life and going to a mile or two within the front line to get this story. Story about the slave women and the Yazidi women with the price tags and divided up by eye color and so forth. And hats off to Daniel for going to Nigeria, Boko Haram territory. These are dangerous places. The press doesn't like to go there, but I think it's much deeper than that. What we've, I know we have a mutual friend, Faith, that wrote to the New York Times journalist and said, "Why aren't you covering this? What's happening?" And he wrote back, I wrote about this in National Review at Christmas, that he wrote back in an email, well, nobody knows who these people are anyhow. So, and it's, well, I'm not going to write about it. So, and our readers aren't interested. So, I mean, it really is up to the religious communities of the United States, all of us, all the different religious communities, to really speak up for this, because the secular world doesn't see it. They don't see that there is a religious persecution, that there are religious groups that are being specifically targeted for eradication underneath the bombs and the conflict. And when the Jewish Holocaust happened, there was also a world war going on, and people didn't see. And when the Armenian genocide happened, there were wars going on and conflict, and this always happens in the context of war and chaos and terror. But and so they have failed to see it or appreciate it or care about it, and it's basically up to the religious communities. And Josh, you had this question about the students and what the colleges could do. This is campaign season, as Frank Wolf always reminds me, and I hope he'll say a word about what we can do regarding that.
Well, yeah.
We're supposed to vote. We know that.
Okay. Well, personnel is policy. And we used to have men like Ronald Reagan and Scoop Jackson. Scoop Jackson was one of the best senators to ever serve. I can remember listening to him and hearing him speak. Tom Lantos, who when Tom would speak at the dais, you could just feel it. Henry Hyde. I mean, it's just, and so we need to do what the Jewish community did. They got me active. They came and would see me about the Soviet refuseniks. We need the church in America and groups in America to do what they did. I think Ronald Reagan and Scoop Jackson and Henry Hyde and Tom Lantos would have done what they did no matter if nobody had ever come in. But people did come in and provided that support. And many of you, if you remember, in 1987, roughly 200,000 people came on the mall to rally for Soviet refuseniks, what was taking place. And Ronald Reagan, if I recall, spoke to them from the White House. We need leaders like that to do it. And for the young people, this is the issue of your day. And what you have to do is to do what IJM, Gary Hogan did a great job in International Justice Ministry on the issue of sexual trafficking. This issue is like that, and we need to take it. Join groups. Voice of the Martyrs, read Nina's newsletters, join Open Doors, join with Chris Seipel, join with Johnny Rogers, join Pray. I mean, there's so much that could be done, and I think you ought to use the 2016 elections in a totally nonpartisan way. no candidate running for office, for president, for House, or Senate, ought to be able to go before any audience between now and November of the following year without being able to articulate their concern and their passion and everything else, and also maybe to be able to have some idea what they are prepared to do when they get elected. We need people like Tom Lantos. We need Henry Hydes. We need Scoop Jacksons, and we need Ronald Reagans. And I believe they're out there, but if they hear from the people, I think they'll kind of rise up a little more than they're currently doing.
It's lovely. We're going to turn, preach. Yep, there. We're going to turn to a student question, just came in, which asks about the role of the Crusades and thinking about, as Christians, how do we navigate, obviously there's been lots of commentary about that, National Prayer Breakfast speech and so forth. How do we navigate the fact that there is an implicit, kind of quiet, latent guilt that can be alive from something that took place 7 centuries before the United States was born? How, as Christians in America today, young Christian students thinking about public office in the future, etc., should we think about that dynamic in engaging this battle?
Go ahead, and then I'll go ahead. Oh. No, you go ahead.
Come on, Dan.
The Crusades are a long time ago. There's nothing wrong with still feeling some of the pain of the Crusades. Religious Jews have the custom of wearing a beard, as I am now, during this time of the year, partly in commemoration of the tragedy that happened to some Jewish communities during the Crusades. And the tragedy was not only for the Jewish communities. But we should not let the very real acknowledgement of bad things that happened a very, very, very long time ago by people who are nothing like the people we're talking about today, Christians in America today, to stop us from doing the right thing now. It seems crazy to me to think that guilt over that event or any event would get in the way of doing the right thing now. Now, maybe the right thing is or isn't a military intervention. That's an important policy question. But the guilt of bad things in the past should keep us from doing bad things in the future, but not from doing good things in the future. And it is true, of course, that some of our political enemies or political opponents will try to hold the Crusades or other events like that over the head of those who wish to act in defense of innocent Christians and other groups now. But we have to let them do their thing and then do our thing too.
To the students, it was the faith community that abolished slavery. It was Martin Luther King. You read every student out there, you ought to read Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail. He brought about the end of segregation. As a Christian, read his writings as a Christian. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, because his faith went to the execution, was hung in Flossenburg State Prison. Dr. Brantley, many of you might have gotten an impact on the Ebola. Dr. Brantley was Samaritan's Purse because of his carrying his faith in Jesus. That's what he said. He went over to Africa and got it. And, you know, I'll tell you something. They were ahead of our own government. Dr. Brantley's people called me and said, Brantley has it. Can he come in? CDC said no. The Secretary of HH wasn't going to do anything. Brantley was out there. Mother Teresa, who would go into the slums of Calcutta and pick up people because of her faith. The Salvation Army will go to any place, anywhere, whatever, because of the faith. So don't fall into what, you know, the president made the comment about the prayer breakfast. But whatever took place for the Crusades, we condemn it. But as people of faith who have led the effort to do things to make a tremendous difference, and read Nicholas Kristof's piece about, you know, Nicholas Kristof ought to get a gold star. He had to get one of these medals they give at the White House. He goes to someone that was god-awful place. Read his piece about 2 weeks ago in the New York Times. He says, every time I go into a place, I see these people where others have evacuated. It's usually a nun or a priest or evangelical or somebody who cares deeply about the faith. People of faith have made a tremendous difference from abolishing slavery right up to just a few months ago where Dr. Brantley got Ebola because of his faith and helped stop the plague that could have come through this whole world.
We're going to take one more One more student question, then we'll return to you. And this comes from a student at Baylor University with whom we've been working on some innovative work on their campus. He knows about Scoop Jackson's legacy, and he has talked about how when one of the things that distinguished his career was using power, not merely having power, but using it, and saying that effectively, when, if I'm summarizing correctly, when you have power and you use it well, you get more power. When you have power and you don't use it, you get less power. What is the dynamic on that end vis-a-vis the United States and Iran and the region today?
Well, one of the things that often comes up in discussions of current events with students is what some people see as the retreat of America from world power. What is the future? What is the future of this country in international affairs? Do we want to continue to be a leader, or do we want to retreat back to our borders for one reason or another? And the way I see it, let the world burn. And again, it doesn't mean being the world's policeman, doesn't mean military action everywhere that there's a crisis. But I think students today need to think, especially students, because they don't have, students who are young like me, who don't have the historical memory, don't have the long view on what the world is like during the Cold War, what the world is like when it was bipolar and not unipolar, let's say. And they need to think very hard about what the world will be like without an American order. We don't need to actually engage in military action everywhere in the world in order to enforce an American order which is, for all of its problems, quite good, quite positive, and in other cases quite benign. We don't have troops everywhere, but we do have aircraft carriers just about everywhere, aircraft carriers that can get just about everywhere. And the question is, what does the future look like when that's no longer the case, when the ability to project American power just about any place at any time, if that comes to pass?
The student's right. Scoop Jackson, I would say Tom Lantos and Henry Hyde used their positions and their power. More people have been helped that never knew why they were helped because of Scoop Jackson, Tom Lantos, and Henry Hyde. And I might say Chris Smith, too, who's currently there. Chris is one of the most underrated guys. If Chris Smith left Congress, the hole in Congress would be so big, I don't think it could be filled. Also, Ronald Reagan, there's a story that they tell. The Soviet foreign minister met with, I think it was George Shultz, and said, every time we meet with Reagan, he said he always raises human rights first. The Secretary of State, Shultz, said, that's interesting. Every time I meet with Reagan, he raises human rights first, too. I mean, these men, Lantos, Jackson, Hyde, Chris Smith, and Ronald Reagan, they made a difference. So the student is exactly right.
I just want to add to something in that, remind the students that we are a democracy and we all have power as citizens. And we need to use that power of our citizenship to demand that our elected officials start talking about this, start acknowledging what is happening in the world. Go to our religious leaders, ask them to start praying consistently, openly, educating their flocks about what is happening to the Christians and the other groups in this world.
Just a quick commentary for the students about the Crusades. And I think Daniel's response was right on about, we should be more concerned about what's going on today. But if you look at the Crusades, it was a direct response to the rise of militant Islam of the 11th century. And if you look at it from that perspective, then, separate it from some of the wrongs that are done. Wrongs are done in every war. But my specific question for the congressman is, you talked about the Nineveh Plains protection units. What exactly are you looking for, and how do we help with the training and equipping of those units to defend their homeland?
They're looking for weapons and support and training. And I think it would be better for it to come from our government or a NATO government. That would be better than just individuals kind of gone out. But they're looking for training, and they're looking for weapons, and they're looking for equipment. The The Peshmerga needs the same thing too, though, because they're up against ISIS. ISIS has the most sophisticated weapons. One of the people said they have former Saddam colonels and generals that are running their operation. They have an intelligence system. They have tanks. They have Humvees. So the Peshmerga needs it, but the Nineveh Plains Unit, they need it too. But it'd be better for a government to do it, a NATO group to do it, than it would be for just an individual to kind of take a dollar out and do it.
Thank you so much. My question actually goes to not the men who are empowered and the men who act and the men who are leaders, which we've heard a lot of today, but the 50% of the population we haven't talked about empowering, which obviously are the women. And I was in Diyala, Iraq in 2009, and one of the groups I met with were the Iraqi female police. And the interesting thing there was it was Sunni and Shia, and the whole reason that they were there was because they were widows, or they had to provide for their families, or they had missing family members. So instead of speaking to the male role, I'd like to hear a little bit about the female role as well. Thank you.
Well, you're right. The Yazidi woman who spoke out over Christmas was a powerful speaker. Anna Eshoo here in the United States in our Congress is leading the effort with regard to filling the special envoy. The women in Afghanistan made all the difference. I agree with you, so I completely agree.
Yeah, one of the leading human rights figures in Iraq is a woman, too, Pascal Warda, with the Hammurabi Human Rights Organization that she founded even before ISIS came in, and it's been active. And their reports are available online through the Assyrian International News Agency.
Another student question. Lucky for us, the students are letting us sit in on their conversation today. But another question has to do with providing the conditions of hope of more jobs. If you're saying essentially, if you are a Sunni male in your 20s and you don't have much to live for, no wife, no job, not a lot of hope, and you hear the cry from someplace in Syria, you know, your people are getting slaughtered, you're more inclined to be drawn into that fight. What would we say about some creative role, non-military, for improving conditions, sort of larger freedom project?
Well, I think the questioner points to a really important theme here, which is that no matter what we think the solution is as far as the immediate harm that's being done, there needs to be a holistic solution. It's not going to be even, especially given all the displacement that's occurred and everything else going around in the region. Simply stopping ISIS will not be enough. There will need to be economic programs, educational programs, healthcare, everything you can think of, because people, I don't want to give people such little credit as to think that depriving them of opportunities drives them into extremism or terrorism or something like that. I think there are deeper and wider forces at work. Nonetheless, in order for there to be a healthy society rebuilt in these places that have been devastated, there is, as the questioner suggests, a need for a very comprehensive solution.
Again, it gets back to the recognition that there is a struggle going on between the Sunnis and the Shiites in this region. And the Iraqi government has not acted like a government of all of its citizens, frankly. And that's how it's partly in this mess, because it excluded Sunnis, its Sunni population. The Iraqi government also has not done much for the Christians or Yazidis, quite frankly. Their army melted away as well. The Kurds opened up their land for these displaced groups to come in. But the Iraqi government treats them almost like they're refugees, not their own citizens. I mean, these are Iraqi citizens moving from one province to the other. And suddenly they're totally mendicant because they've been stripped of all their property by ISIS. And they're totally dependent on international humanitarian aid. The Iraqi government is not helping these folks readjust and resettle somewhere else in the country where it's safe and get their lives back. So I think it's a problem that extends to the Sunnis of both Iraq and Syria. That's been part of the problem. It's been a sectarian mindset, and it was a sectarian mindset before under Saddam Hussein and under the Assad dynasty. So that is a big problem that's driving this. Again, it's a religious problem.
Let's take 2 more questions. You, sir.
Thank you very much. I have a question. Acting with the military in Iraq and Syria, it doesn't help because we are not fighting the ideology. We are fighting the groups. So if we defeat ISIS right now, tomorrow we're going to have something else. And responding to that question of seeing Sunnis going and seeing their families slaughtered, is the act of ideology, because why we don't see the Shias, if you want to play that game of Shia Sunnis, why we don't see the Shias create terrorist groups in Bahrain? They see their families members over there, the people from Shia community getting slaughtered, killed over there.
I think you have a very good point. It isn't only military. We could talk about that, but it is how do you fight the ideology? And an example was during the 70s and the 80s, bipartisan, by Republicans and Democrats, beginning with President Kennedy, the psychological warfare with regard against the Soviet Union, against communism. And it was all, the AFL-CIO, Lane Kirkland, did a tremendous job, but it was a psychological battle against communism. So you're exactly right. Just to think in terms of military, you're going to have to deal with the military, but I think it has to be across the board, and you have to deal with the ideology all around the world, and I agree with you.
Just on that exact note, thinking about then President Reagan was willing to call things by their name. He was willing to call evil when he saw evil, and that's not always the way with all of our current political leaders.
And at the very heart of that ideology is the zero tolerance towards apostates and blasphemers. It's a religious intolerance, religious freedom problem.
Question? Here? Cheryl?
This question is for Nina. I'm wondering how you responded to the questions at the museum tying domestic religious freedom and international religious freedom.
Thank you for that question, because I meant to say that religious freedom, actually, rather than curtailing other freedoms, is the fountainhead of all freedoms. Because without religious freedom, you don't have religion expression either, nor do you have, in most societies, women's rights. And, you know, I remember reading Azar Nafisi, a friend of mine who's from Iran, was there during the revolution. And she wrote in her book about that experience, saying, I found myself being totally defined by the vision of a blind, aging Ayatollah who told me how to dress, how to wear, you know, my hair, how to, what I could do, who I could mingle with, you know, my whole life. So we take this for granted, but without religious freedom, you lose all of those freedoms. And you know, there are, no rights are absolute, and there's going to be some overlap with other perceived rights, and that's in this country. Those disputes are settled through the courts on a case-by-case basis.
Last question that came in via social media. I think, Tyler, you've got our Values and CAP handle back there, involves social media. Is there some constructive way, what's your most practical piece of advice about how social media could be helpful in places like Iraq and Syria?
You're the youngest member of the commission. I think you should answer.
Since I know what social media is, just kidding. Just kidding. I'm sure everybody at the table knows how to use a computer. So I think, I mean, this really goes back to points that were made already, but awareness. Here's something for the college students. Social media is not going to fix anything. That's the first point that needs to be made. It's very easy to be an armchair activist, to sit behind your computer and complain about things or argue with people in the comments section of a Facebook post or something. But social media can be useful because in a way that was never possible before in the history of the world, social media can facilitate the movement of information and the raising of awareness. I mean, the journalist, who said, well, I don't write about those people because nobody knows who those people are. Well, of course, nobody knows who the people are if the journalist won't write about it. Well, guess what? This is the first time in modern history where we don't depend on journalists to know about things. The mainstream media doesn't have the upper hand anymore. And so if the young people, whether it was, everyone probably remembers when, I think this is still in Meredith's Twitter handle, the Nun letter for when they were marking the doors of Christians as Nun for Nazarene or the equivalent Arabic word. And so in response and in defiance, millions of people around the world adopted that image as their profile picture on social media. Those are little things and they become trite sometimes, but to the extent that social media will play a role in this, it will play a role in the spreading of information and the raising of awareness, which has to be the first step before anything else will change.
I want to second that and just say that social media alone is not going to do it. It's going to be important for sharing information, for getting the word out, and just to look at the example of the Boko Haram schoolgirls from Chibok who were abducted over a year ago now. I don't know if they were among the 1,000 who were liberated this week. They haven't said so yet. They're still, I guess, interviewing them, but that was a huge social media campaign. Hashtag bring back our girls. Everybody was talking about it. The First Lady was involved. And then, a couple of months later, we took back our drones. We stopped advising, sharing intelligence. Our team came back from Nigeria. And these girls, these young teenage girls, and I've had 4 of them in my office. Frank's met them. Their sisters, the 219 who are still captive, have been sex slaves. That's what they've been doing. They've been sex slaves and forcibly converted to Islam for the last year.
Randall Everett, who started the Wilberforce 21, has been working with a group to break down the firewall. And BBG has been very reluctant to do anything about it, whereby you can literally contact everyone. If you go into China and type in the name of the Dalai Lama in downtown Beijing, he does not exist. And so what Randall wants to do is to break it down so you can go in everywhere. The Pope could have a mass. Anybody, the President of the United States could speak and bypass these governments. And yet our own government, BBG, and for some reason this administration, they just won't even move. But I think the internet, social media can make a tremendous difference. Thank you for putting the program on.
On that very hopeful note about a pessimistic subject, we thank you so much for coming, and good afternoon.